Hello. In this episode of the AS for Architecture podcast, I spoke with Professor Chris L. Smith to discuss his book Architecture After Deleuze and Guattari, published by Bloomsbury 2023. Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari remain a big noise, with their significance for architectural theory and design practice lying in their radical rethinking of concepts like form, process, and relationality. Their writing offers a philosophical framework that rejects fixed hierarchies, linear causality, and static structures, but instead emphasizes multiplicity, fluidity, dynamic systems. Chris and I discuss how their work has shifted architectural discourse away from traditional modernist principles of order and function towards experimental, process-orientated, and politically and environmentally engaged design practices. As the man suggests, might not we all be Deleuze-Guattarian architects now?
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Chris L. Smith. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation, one that I've been hoping to have with you for a while after first seeing your book, which we're going to be talking about, Architecture After Deleuze and Guattari. I think that's how you pronounce their names, which you published in 2023 with Bloomsbury. Chris, before we get stuck into these two fellows, can we get stuck into you? Who are you and where do you come from?
So it's quite simple in some respects and not simple, I guess, in others. So I'm Chris L. Smith. I'm the Professor of Architectural Theory at the University of Sydney in Australia. I'm coming to you and talking at the moment, though, in a room in the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh. So where I am for a little while at the moment, and I grew up in suburban Australia. I went to university like people do, but first generation university people do. So I was introduced to architecture because I had an uncle. I was lucky enough to have an uncle who worked at the university. He used to drive like a van around the university delivering mail, but also body parts to the medical school. and my uncle luckily took me to work one day and showed me around all the different departments and faculties at the university, and it was architecture that I fell in love with at that point in time and thought I could do something within.
Does the Australian university system operate similarly to the UK, or is it more like the American system where you go in and you sort of do something closer to a general ed before focusing?
Yeah, the Australian system's very similar to the UK system. So you're effectively straight out of high school deciding on a career largely. I mean, so some people decide again. In a way, I myself, I fell in love with architecture, but I always felt I could be or could have been and can be like many and multiple things. I I tend to have a complete love for whatever it is I'm doing at any point in time. And if that's reading philosophy, then it's philosophy. If I'm designing something, it's designing. If I'm building, it's building. I'm pretty amorous. I think I can fall for pretty much everything.
Yeah, I have that. I have this weakness as well. I think I'm addicted to falling in love with things.
Yeah.
The weak.
I think it becomes probably exhausting for those around me, but for me, it's it's a rather pleasant way of being.
Yeah, for sure. It's the way you are. I'm guessing this was in the early to mid 90s. Is that right? That you started studying architecture. What was the thing that grabbed you?
Yeah, it was early 90s. It was a couple of things. I was tossing up strangely between architecture and psychology at the time, and I came to the conclusion that I needed more masculine credibility or something. Like strangely enough, I thought architecture might deliver that. It turns out I was wildly wrong, and but that was the original decision making.
Trying to mediate between your, I guess, non-university education, try to make it acceptable.
I think it was partly that. I didn't I was aspirational in a whole lot of senses. I needed to escape. My background was, one that someone would probably like to escape. I sound sometimes a little bit rounded, like my vowels are rounded, and I cut my consonants a little bit, especially for an Australian. But that's largely pretense. It was attenuated. Like my at one point, I had a partner who was a speech therapist, and so the way I speak is attenuated. But as you know, most of what I am and do in life is also a little bit like that. It's all sort of manipulation, attenuation, shift in some way, which strangely as well, I think, is what particularly drew me to the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, which is this sort of idea of when you read it for the first time, when you read Anti-Oedipus or you read A Thousand Plateaus, you come to a sense very quickly that one need not be grounded in the habitual or traditional ways in which we've come to think of ourselves or our identities. And for me, this was an entirely, like, it was a blessing in a way. Like I never felt myself to be consistently one thing or another, and on multiple grounds. And so, reading this sort of work in large respects sort of saved me from myself in some ways, or from an image of myself which I didn't need to maintain.
That's really fascinating. I was thinking that the influence of the dismembered bodies your uncle
Yeah.
drove around was also inherently formational here, the deconstruction of the body, literally in the case of your uncle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful image, and that's probably something in it as well. I used to love when I started working in the UK. So I started my lecturing life at Newcastle University in the north, and when I turned up, I felt very out of place, because of the background that I'd had, and I at one point had a student bound up to me and sort of said, "Oh, his uncle worked at was a professor at the university I went to in Australia." And I said, "Oh, that's really nice." I said, "My uncle works there too," but I didn't explain to him what my uncle actually did.
So, to get to your book, how did this come about? Obviously, as you say, there's this formational or foundational kind of influence. And I remember the first time that I was introduced to Thousand Plateaus, I likewise found it very kind of eye-opening and exciting, extremely exciting.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of those books that is entirely entrancing and perplexing, probably in equal measure. The way I got to it was slightly uh, particular and odd. I'd started a doctorate. I'd always been interested in body architecture relations, and that's across my university life, and it was always a point of fixation, the sort of folding and unfolding of one in respect to the other, bodies and architecture, and in a type of composition, and my doctorate, when I started it, was concerned with evolutionary biology and its relationship to architectural theory. And I was particularly fixated on Darwin and Darwinism at the time. And when I read The Origin of Species for the first time, it was almost traumatic as an experience, like in terms of shifting my world so fundamentally, completely, and that I felt, really destabilized by it for quite a long time. But then over time, the new world that then opens up, is fascinating. And I wanted to, in the doctorate, talk about the way in which ideas migrate from one discipline to another. So that interdisciplinary movement of ideas, and largely ideas of evolutionary biology into architectural theory. And then to think through that movement, I found a really basic and limited repertoire, of methods or of methodologies or of ways of actually tracking the logic from one discipline to another. So in architecture, we tend to have this terrible, terrible habit of using analogy all the time. If something is like X in one regard, then it's like X in another regard. And I mean, a lot of work in biomimetics at the moment in architecture plays this mistake out over and over again. And an analogy wasn't so helpful because there was something more fundamental to the way in which architects were thinking about evolutionary biology. And so that led me to philosophy. It led me first of all to Foucault and then to Canguilhem and a variety of others before I eventually got to Deleuze and Guattari, and I started effectively with 1,000 Plateaus. And when I picked up the book, picking up a book like that and starting with it's a sort of revolutionary act. Again, it was the second big book to completely shift my world, but also in ways that took a very long time to settle. Like you have to, I think when you first pick it up and you read it, you have to keep moving through it and not pause and reflect for too long on tiny points, at least to begin with. And you sort of are grabbing what you can when you can and thinking through what you can when you can. And over a period of time, you realize that your whole sense of self and also your sense of the world beyond the self has shifted, is now considerably different, and the ramifications are really quite huge. And so I got to Deleuze and Guattari in that way. I particularly fixated on, at that time, I was particularly interested in their political philosophy. A lot of work had started in the early 90s in architecture, with a particular fixation on certain aesthetic drives in the work and aesthetic possibilities in the work, or aesthetic translations of the work. But it was actually the politics of it that mattered the most to me at that moment.
And that politics is strongly post-1968 Marxian thinking.
Yeah, it's post Marx and post Freud. I guess what it starts doing, in a basic sort of political sense, is critiquing and thinking about regimes of thought, like so the way in which we habitually think about anything, and problematizing things as a regime of thought. I think up until that point, I might have been on a quest to deal with truth or something, or an idea of a singular truth, or what might matter, or a way of organizing my own thinking and my own life in some sort of under some sort of heading or criteria that I today consider problematic. I might have been looking to live authentically or something odd like that, or to reduce the dissonance I might have otherwise been feeling about myself by somehow balancing what I do and who I am and things like that. And then when you get to Deleuze and Guattari, you realize, well, the logic shifts so massively that you start negotiating things as belonging to, as occupying, as entwined with regimes of thought. And these regimes of thought are often, so Marxism would be a sort of regime of thought, like Freudian psychoanalysis would be a regime of thought. And they're particularly axiomatic regimes in the sense that if I was a Marxist, it wouldn't matter what I was doing in the world. I mean, I could see two lovers kissing passionately on a street corner, and I could probably put it into Marxian terms, and do a decent analysis of it, and the same with like psychoanalysis. A psychoanalyst could see someone, I don't know, laboring in a mine shaft, and tell you what that actually was implying, in the psychosexual dynamic world or something, right? So those regimes of thought are axiomatic in the sense that there's nothing that can escape them in a way. And what Deleuze and Guattari start doing is first of all, generating a type of visibility to the regimes that are in play. And then doing something that, I mean, it's often talked about in terms of what they often call schizoanalysis, but it's what they start doing is destroy that, in order to open up alternate ways of conceiving of things or thinking of things or engaging with things. And this is not to generate a new logic or a new regime of thought which is more comprehensive or more thorough, more rigorous, better. It's actually just to demonstrate that things can emerge, can enter the realm of common sense, via different ways in, different routes in. And so for me, that was sort of fundamentally important, because what it starts to imply in a political sense is that we don't need to classify and situate societies or groups or individuals or dispositions, under some sort of axiomatic framework. We don't have to put gender in any sort of, crazy, illusory binary, for example. We don't need to put sexuality in the category boxes in which, we like to deposit it, etc. That instead, actually, what we can do is concentrate on what something does and how it does it, and let it be a sort of matter of exploration and experimentation rather than a matter of codification.
Fascinating. I'm kind of interested in the motivations behind this moment, because the way that you're explaining it, Freud, Darwin, Marx, the great sort of forefathers, I suppose, of the modern epoch, certainly the 19th century modern epoch at least, still seems to be wedded to an idea, as you say, of a capital T truth and a kind of monolithic idea of entities and knowledge, and which leads to preferencing of certain ontological ideas.
Yeah.
So are they fighting this for any particular reason, or is this part of a kind of the paradigm of postmodernity, this kind of questioning of this whole...
Yeah, the metastructure.
The metastructure, yeah.
Yeah, I think they're fighting it for a variety of reasons, and probably for slightly different reasons as well. So Guattari trained as a psychoanalyst. He was working as a psychotherapist at Le Bourd at the time that he meets Deleuze. In that context, which was the psychiatric clinic context. I mean, psychiatric clinics after World War II started to look very much like concentration camps, right? The same concentration camps we fought to get rid of. Mm-hmm. We found that we ourselves were operating, and to some extent still are operating in our world, in our countries, in our states. And so he wanted to rethink what's the relation should be, the politics of those situations. But at the same time, he was interested in consciousness itself. And so you've got the two things playing out, a sort of politics, like a broader social politics, and also an institutional politics. And at the same time, a question of consciousness itself and what someone is and how someone is. And so at places like Le Bourd, where Guattari was working with, Jean Horry, another psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist by training, they start working on the idea that your consciousness is not your own. So we no longer need to imagine that I am becomes the core thing that we always say, and we think, I am X, I am Y, I am, and as if we were enclosed entities in a way. So if I was a psychotherapist and I was treating an individual, when I talk to them one-on-one and I fixate on how are you, and what I'm doing is I'm sort of constructing a logic for a singular self, as if everything relates and is you, right? But what Guattari starts doing and thinking through, I guess, is that consciousness is socially constructed. Therefore, he starts working in group therapy relations, much more dynamic relations in the construction of consciousness. He starts also, in an architectural sense, bringing down the walls of the asylum. In a way, seeing the hospital itself as part of the construction of individual sensibilities. And so there's almost like a line or a cosmos or something like that, from consciousness to a type of politics that is all about, liberating people from the structures that have otherwise, necessarily contained them and told them how to be and how they should be. So even on simple matters, like if you think of things like, Valentine's Day and the, questions of love and the relationships we have, there's all the rhetoric will be a type of image that's being built of the self. So, I will say to someone, you make me whole, they'll tell me that I make them complete. There'll be this sort of closing of a type of loop, as if wholeness and completion were attainable and were a thing, right? And it's the same in psychoanalysis. It's the same in a lot of discourse. It's the same in most religions. They'll sort of give you a sort of image of you can have it and have it all, and you can be whole and you can be full and you can be complete in a way. And it's actually the regime of thought which is constructing the pathology itself. So we pathologize societies, whole societies. Sometimes Frantz Fanon, working in Algeria, effectively sort of said that it was an entire pathologization of a race of people, that was going on there, that was only constructed because of the dominant discourse, the dominant thinking applied to it. And so Guattari's political drive that also played itself out in the psychological, that's a science zone, was picked up and played with and became almost completely intermeshed, I guess, with Deleuze's more philosophical background. And that's sort of what then comes out in Anti-Oedipus, A Thousand Plateaus, the Kafka book, and What is Philosophy, their last collaborative work.
Fantastic. Very, very fascinating. Do you like this idea of wholeness and completeness? It's very seductive.
Yeah, part of the problem is it's seduction in a way. We're often sold things that are types of seductions or something. Architecture does it all the time, of course. When we talk about a notion of home, for example, there's a type of image that's being generated that becomes a type of hegemonic image that we perpetuate. If you pick up any number of those sort of glossy journals that pump out images of architecture and houses after houses after houses, and what they're doing is sort of just constructing an image of happy bourgeois existence and life that that helps to employ architects, of course, but also but it becomes a rather, it's a tautological, it has its own feedback loop in a way. I then start dreaming that that's the type of house I want, that's the type of life I want, the type of family I want, and I start imagining that I'll be happy like that too. And it's a highly problematic process.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of disguises. I mean, I find that very fascinating about particularly the communication of home and housing, as you say, in its neatness, in its luxury.
Yeah.
Where it's social housing, it's communicated as a form of luxury, and disguising, therefore, the anti-luxury lifestyles of the folk that produce it.
Yeah.
Particular amongst which is the architect themselves, who are probably paid sometimes quite a lot less than the tradesmen who are making it.
Yeah,
which
that's
is
right.
fascinating, really.
Yeah. It's like Viollet-le-Duc used to call them, like a maçon qui parle le latin, a mason or a builder who speaks Latin is the architect. But yes, builders at the moment are, as they rightfully should be, well remunerated.
You suggest in the book that 21st century architecture is inherently Deleuze-Guattarian. What do you mean? I guess.
Yeah, I guess at the outset it's a provocation, and
Mm.
it's a sort of provocation, and but effectively what I'm arguing and what I'm suggesting is that because of the relationship that Deleuze and Guattari and their work has had with architecture, like from the early 90s, I guess what starts to happen is it's hard now in architecture schools anywhere around the world not to hear the discourse in playing itself out in particular ways and not to feel the influence. I think at this point there's now generations of architects, students of architecture out there in the world who knowingly or not, are a little bit more Deleuzean, a little bit more Guattarian than they probably realize. There's been a sort of liberation of their thinking that's occurred through, largely through architecture schools, because of Deleuze and Guattari. There is that shift occurs in multiple respects. It's when we think of form itself, it's when we think of matter now and material, and we're thinking of it in a somewhat different way to what we used to, in a way that's not the same sort of logic that would be applied to when we talk about assembling and assemblage, when we talk about the process or the performativity of architecture. That discourse is all been inflected somewhat by Deleuze and Guattari in a variety of ways. And so I think also, there's this sort of general, general is not the right word, but there's a particular post-structuralism that has flowed through architecture schools. And it's in part because of a resonance which right at the outset there is between architecture as a discipline, as a process, as a logic, and post-structural philosophy overall, that becomes an easy sort of departure point for thinking through architecture or negotiating it.
The way you're talking about it, it almost sounds like this Deleuze-Guattarian mode of thinking. And I agree with you. I think it has become entirely embedded in the process of education and therefore of the practice of many architects, or certainly the way that architecture as a profession presents itself through its great works to the public, which is a slightly different thing in that most architects aren't operating theoretically. And now increasingly most urban architecture has nothing to do with theory or thought at all. It's a mechanical, technical engineering solution.
Yeah, I think that's partly true and partly not. I think I think when, yeah, it reminds me of what sometimes happens in theory lectures and in architecture schools, which is there'll always be at the end of the semester, a student will write to you to sort of say, I don't know why I had to do this course. Like I'm planning on being an architect. And when I get this email at the end of every semester, a little part of me does die, and the problem with that student's thought is that just because you're operating, with preconception, and just because you're repeating a logic, that has become a habit in a discipline, does not mean that you're not operating theoretically or that you're not operating politically. What it means is that you're operating in a theoretically banal way and a politically dangerous conservative way, right? It means that you're effectively condoning all that is of the moment in what one is doing, by not asking the most basic questions of what it is you do. There's a lecture that Deleuze gave at one point to cinema students. I mentioned it in the book, and he said to the students, si vous êtes pris dans la rêve de l'autre, vous êtes foutu. If you are to be trapped in the dreams of others, you are fucked, is what he says. And indeed, a student or an architect or anyone involved in, the constructing of the world, if they feel that they aren't thinking through or challenging what it is they're thinking, or challenging even the rules of the profession, if they think it's okay, not to explore and experiment in a way, then they are really trapped in the dreams of others. It's not that they're without a dream or that they're just banal in the system. They're trapped in a way, and that becomes highly problematic. I mean, that would just perpetuate all the horror, and it would be a waste of a life and career, I can imagine.
Yeah, I am interested also in this idea of their assimilation, this Deleuze and Guattarian thinking, this assimilation into the practice of architects. And I think Dana Cuff talked about this idea of the way that the internal logic of architecture, which is inherently bound to money and markets, therefore, and which we are currently under a regime of neoliberalism, but has been under other forms before, sort of facilitates and permits these discrepant voices, these marginal voices, and refolds them into the center through practice. And I was thinking about, for example, a character like Zaha Hadid, who is obviously very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, where in the early 1980s, she's practicing at the very margins of what even architecture could be. And by the end of it, she's a dame, she's knighted, a member of the British Empire, and her work is the stuff which is referred to, and she has disciples.
Yeah.
So does their work still have the power to disassemble what we do?
Yeah. No, I mean, I like to think so. I mean, but the oddity of the work in some respects is that the politics that is deployed and that is engaged, I guess, in Deleuze and Guattari is it's a non-ideological politics. So it's not inherently of the left or of the right in a way. It's a politics that shifts the field itself out of that sort of ideological place. And in doing so, you get this joyous fascination, joyous/horror fascination with things like capitalism, for example. Capitalism must be and should be thought of as another regime of thought. It's been entirely axiomatic. It's hard to escape. It produces this complete convertibility, mediation between everything. Bodies can be sold and bought, and bought, in exchange for money. And there's this sort of incredible mobility that capitalism sort of allows, right? And then what Deleuze and Guattari also point out is that there's and Guattari in particular in his solo work, is that capitalism is a little bit like a steamroller. It's flattened everything into a type of singular unitary basis in a way, which might be called currency, or the dollar or something. So, on the one hand, you end up with this sort of plane where, everything's negotiable and it's translatable, transferable, transformable. I can transform my work as an academic, for, a nice new pair of expensive shoes or something like that, and there's nothing at all between the work I do and a pair of shoes, and yet one is made compatible, and in capitalism, and but I think when it comes to it, what Deleuze and Guattari won't do is tell you they're not dealing with something like right and wrong and truth, right? So they're giving you ways of negotiating things, but that comes with a type of privileging. You can tell, it's very simple to sort of see what is privileged, the opening up of possibilities, privilege, the removal of the barriers that would otherwise send libido only down one course, like indeed, would be problematic, would be exactly what they want, to open everything up, to allow possibility, but at the same time, I don't think it's the type of philosophy that's going to say, X is evil and Y is not, because that would merely be to impose just another, set of logics or another axiom, over us, which is entirely unnecessary. I think what they're asking for is something more like experiment, explore, play, and that's the type of negotiation. They're in that respect, the interest is far more in what would be called an ethics rather than a morality, and so, I mean, then under the Spinozan definition, morality is those laws that are imposed from above that say, X is always wrong, Y is always right. It's that type of imposition, and ethics is always highly contingent and relates to the situation in which you're in and the problem which you're facing at the moment, and then how you maneuver or negotiate that at that moment in time, in a way. And so it's much more at that type of micro rather than macro, I guess, or ethical rather than moral sort of level that this sort of politics plays out. In something like architecture, this is why, when we talk about ethico-aesthetics, in a way, what they're really talking about is a direct relationship, I guess, between, what we think of as aesthetics and what we might think of as ethics. And, so, the best way of thinking it, I think maybe the best way of thinking it is a little bit like if you're an architect and you have a project and you know what the brief is and you know what the site is and you know what the users are, and you can take all those pieces and bits of information and more so, and negotiate it in a way. You're pulling together, or you're assembling sort of from all of that, and then when you come to sit down and you start drawing, and you think, no, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, I'll throw that one out. And, that design's not quite right for reason X, etc. And then at a certain moment, if you get really lucky as an architect, you draw something which is just right for what it is you're trying to achieve, for the problem you're facing, for that moment. And what you're drawing, what you're negotiating there is not represent completely or only representational as such, like it's right because of, how it's intersecting with a type of real world, a concrete world, and a world of concrete, of real concrete and abstract thoughts in a way. And, and once you've got it right, the aesthetic often of what one is doing then carries forward, keeps going, keeps perpetuating in a way. And so it's a little bit like if you design the perfect doorway to building X and it's just right, you then know what happens after you step you step across the threshold. You then know how you enter the next space. You then know how someone needs to, slide through an exterior detail. You know exactly what form a step has to take. And there's those beautiful moments in architecture and design and art where you have the strange sense that it's leading you rather than you leading it. And that sort of ethico-aesthetics is an aesthetic sort of drive that is making little judgments of right and wrong, with a little R and a little W. And so not matters of truth, but the right and wrong, the ethics of exactly what to do and how to do it in a way. And when you're attentive to that, then you've got, if you're very lucky, the production of some really decent particularized, architecture.
Can you give any examples?
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of that. I mean, there's multiple of these. I mean, I wrote at one point about, a particular window seat that Alto designed in a way, and he's designing it not for an abstract body or any body. He's designing it for a very particular body, and he used to say to his students that when you're designing a window, don't just design a window, imagine your lover in it. Actually, I think Alto actually said, "Imagine your girlfriend in it," but we'll contemporize it, but with the word lover, I guess. We'll contemporize it and make it just slightly more racy by saying, and when you're doing that, as Alto would do, it then becomes a highly particularized place, right? It's highly eroticized in a way. It's the perfect window seat for the perfect, the body of that intimately and that you want to place in just a particular way, looking out to a view in just a particular direction, framed just as it has to be in a way. And fixating on that sort of level of detail, I think is, the right way of going in some ways. I mean, it would be talked about as radical empiricism would be the philosophical deferral there. And what that's about is largely looking really close and tightly at something in and of itself, in its detail. So not imposing rules or laws or ideas of typology or style or anything like that from above, but focusing on something like an event or a happening, or someone's bum against a particular windowsill, for example, and then letting that unfold the architecture. I had a colleague who used to work with Pietala in Finland, and the office at one point they were all working on a childcare center, early childhood childcare center, and people were designing all sorts of things and having very good ideas, and but the ideas were all over the place. And Pietala walked in one day and just said, "Stop! Like what we're going to do is I want you to get the hook right, and it's the hook on which the small child, takes off their big jacket, and when they come in, and then they hang the jacket on the hook. And what should the hook be, for this child? How does it need to be, right?" And the idea was that in getting that right, which is exactly what happened in the project, in getting that right, you then say, well, in order to, hang the coat, they put their little lunchbox somewhere, or they might want to sit to take off their winter boots then as they're hanging the coat. And all of a sudden, architecture itself, whole architecture start opening up and transforming. And, but it's based on a tight particularity rather than a bigger, broader, what would often be a generality.
That's a really very great example. And I was thinking, as you were speaking, about all of those buildings that I do find stimulating and poetic and I suppose homely in a broad sense, are those buildings that, make you feel, I guess, recognized in a way, sort of as a human being with the senses and values and ideas and hopes, all of those things.
Yeah.
Your book covers a huge amount of ground, obviously, and we can't touch on all of it, and I don't want to do that. But I'm interested in this word that you used earlier of assemblage, which, as I understand it, as I took from reading your book, is about revealing architecture as a relational process rather than as an object-orientated practice. Could you speak to that a little bit? What does this mean? What's relating to what that it wasn't relating to before?
Yeah, I know. It's a complex one, because I mean, effectively, when we talk about assemblage or agencement, is the translation. What we're really talking about is what could be framed almost as endless and everything in a way. It comes from a sort of understanding that everything is connected to everything, which is probably a truism of a certain kind, right? Like, nothing is completely removed from anything else, necessarily. But effectively, when we're talking about assemblage, you're talking about I think of it often in terms of like fade and focus. And so when I want to achieve something, when I have a task I want to achieve, I focus in a particular way, and other things fade out of view. So if I'm thirsty on my throat, like I've had a little bit of a cold, so my throat's a little bit rough, and I've finished my water, but I look at my glass of water on the table. Then I think my throat, and I feel my throat, and I think about the cold, and there's a sort of assembling of items and elements and pathologies and dispositions, and a whole series of things that are brought into focus, and other things sort of fade at that sort of moment. So architects are always doing it. They're bringing certain things into the realm of perceptibility, and they're sending other things out in a way. They're making some things less discernible, some things more discernible. The pipe work often ends up hidden in a wall and made imperceptible, even though we know it's there, or we assume it's there. And so there's this negotiation of what's brought into the frame, what's sort of pushed out. The idea of agencement or assemblage has another particular characteristic that's quite vital, I think, for architecture, and that is that the elements that are assembled, that are brought together, maintain in Deleuze and Guattari's sort of world, they maintain heterogeneity. That is to say that we don't make things homogeneous by bringing them together, and we're not looking to homogenize or shut down or totalize in a way. So I can think of architectures that attempt a type of homogeneity, where the architect's core aim is to produce a singular image, and a well thought out singular image and singular meaning and this sort of thing. And then I can think of architecture which is more heterogeneous, where if you think of the Pompidou Center, for example, it's an entirely heterogeneous sort of expression. You can see what's going on, where it's going on, and the elements are allowed their sort of life in a way. And so the idea of assemblage is the bringing things together, but knowing full well that those things that are brought together maintain an existence and a life of their own in a way. So I could swallow you, for example, into a nuclear family set, right? And I can imagine you and maybe offspring and this sort of scenario, and compose you solely in that way. But full well that at a certain time in the night, you feel the need to go out running, or to escape, or to be otherwise or elsewhere in a way. And so you're exercising your heterogeneity whilst being part of that homogeneous sort of set. And so it speaks to assembly, sort of speaks to a type of multiplicity, but also a type of pluralism in any element at the same time. I used to think about it. If you think about the elements of an assemblage, I've thought about it in the past, and indeed did some work some years ago with a very dear colleague, Andrew Ballantyne, where we looked at the way in which elements in music, for example, compose of us, brought and assembled together. So we looked at, I think, the ecstasy tablet at one point, and the ecstasy tablet in a type of assemblage, which is the rave, getting ready, assemblage, the lining up outside a nightclub, the knowing what portion of a drug you're going to take at what time of the night, and this sort of thing. There's a type of dance, body, raver, music, throbbing beat, assemblage, right? And the ecstasy tablet's part of that. But that same ecstasy tablet, if I was a soldier in the Second World War, marching overnight, and I'm taking exactly that same tablet in a way, and in that case, I'm part of a gun machine, military march, fascist assemblage, in a way. And so elements can be, it's the same element, but in different things, they mean different things. So if I play this out a little bit in terms of things like the way we might think of gender, for example, the rule is something like that. An element is, the assemblage is the unit of what something is. And so what doesn't matter is the element. So, it's a little bit like I could use a hammer to make a house, or I could use a hammer to kill someone, right? And so it's how you use the tool that sort of matters. And if you think of that in terms of gender and biological construction and the type of discourse that's going on at the moment, around questions of gender, what starts to matter is not the organ itself that one has or hasn't. Actually, it's what one does with it, and it's the use of things. So nothing has a type of inherent meaning. Meaning itself is constructed and is assembled. We are what we do, not that's it.
The agency of stuff is also another theme that you seem to touch on in the book, or touch on in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. And the idea that matter has an agency of its own. Materials, and therefore, obviously, this is particularly pertinent to architecture, have their own vitality. And I was thinking that the clearest idea behind this, and there's been a lot of discourse, a lot of scholarship recently around this idea of the kind of deeper meaning of stuff, the agency of stuff in the production of space, in the production of buildings. Yeah. But I was wondering, how does it sit within theirs, and does it point to a particular outcome? Are they leveraging this idea with a particular view and around environmental thinking? Because obviously, in the late 20th century, we have the emergence of a kind of deep green ethic, and I was wondering if it was connected in some way to that.
Yeah, I think so. I think the story. I guess the story sort of is, one way of thinking the story is that when we give over an impersonalized consciousness, and when we know that, I mean, I myself am not, I would conceive of myself a little bit like steam on the bathroom mirror, it's almost like a condensation, and it's a condensation of so much. I have my father's eyes, and I started growing a beard because of Bruce Willis, and I think because of characters like Darwin and Deleuze and Guattari and amongst a lot of others, and so I don't personalize myself or need to personalize myself in any I don't need to rarefy the self in any sort of particular way. But part of that also means allowing the life, architecture, and our what is exterior to us, some of the life. It's like a paying recompense for the giving over, or the depersonalization of the self becomes a sort of recompense that's paid to the external world in a way. And it's a little bit like we in architecture, the story is a long story, but the story of we make architecture, and then after that the city makes us, as Churchill said at one point, and he's sort of saying it for conservative type of purposes at the time, but the logic there is that there's a complete intimacy between on the one hand we construct, on the other hand we are constructed in a way. And so what is the constructor there, or what has the capacity, or the agency to construct, right? It's us, but it's also architecture, right? Architecture is constructing in a way. And then one wonders where the agency of architecture stops or doesn't start, or ends. And I like to imagine that we can push the bounds far further than we have at the moment. I'm doing some work at the moment on effectively an erotics of architecture, architecture as erotic, which is not architecture as the backdrop to eroticism. It's not architecture, that designed to be erotic, or architecture that happens to be photographed in various ways. It's actually like, an erotics of architecture itself. And I don't, and just because architecture, doesn't have sex like we do, it doesn't mean that it doesn't. Anyway, it's just an alternate sort of mode of operation. So I quite like the idea that, material, what we know of material is that, the closer we look at it, the more complex and perplexing it is, the more it opens up an entire world. You know that the material of everything is entwined with thought at the same time and indissociable sometimes from the thought that constructs of it or allows us to conceive of it. And so, I like to imagine that the material world is far more affective and effective than we have habitually sort of allowed it. I think also what starts to matter in architecture is that there's a type of logic which sort of says the way we deal with material is it says a lot about the way we deal with others. So we used to say the way we deal with other races, right? For example, says a lot about how we deal with our race, or how we deal with ourselves, or how we deal with other animals or other genders or other, like whatever it is, it says a lot about how we deal with ourselves. And it's exactly the same with material. We can either force ourselves upon it, what they call, a hylomorphic way, which is to sort of say that form dominates and descends from above onto matter, or we can actually work with it, right? And in an ecological sense, far better to work with, than to impose heavily upon, seems to be, what seems to be working as a type of logic, or at least a type of operational way of engaging with the planet at this sort of point in time. Don't assume that something doesn't have a logic until we impose it, is sort of the rule.
Mm.
Because if we do that, it's a little bit like that moment of Tony Blair, like heading off to Iraq you know, because in his story, that society had no structure until we imposed ours upon it, or he and George Bush effectively imposed theirs upon it. And that's hylomorphic, that's
Mm.
hylomorphism. And, Gilbert Simondon would sort of say that hylomorphism is the attitude of someone who only sees what goes into and comes out of a workshop. And that's also a decent definition, regrettably, for a lot of architects and architecture, right? If you're really happy just to draw lines on a piece of paper and then send it to someone and say, build it out of whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, I think we've probably got a problem. We've just got the imposition, a type of imposition from above that doesn't care at all about the material of the world itself.
Mm. Yes, and I can see that use of the word erotic. I've always thought that, to go to your Tony Blair example, I've always thought that the whole of that thing, of that fundamental violence,
Yeah,
was bound somewhere deeply within a kind of erotic sensibility. I think this stuff in that's going on at the moment is likewise some peculiar
yeah.
form of eroticism.
Yeah, no, entirely, entirely. I think the erotics and the violence of it are all entirely bound. I remember that moment when Tony Blair was saying that a bomb could, well, indeed there was a rolling of tanks into Heathrow at that time as well. But the idea was that like a missile could be launched and hit London within 45 minutes, I think was the statement at the time, and again you just get this. Flurry and fluster for sort of like panic, which allows and then accommodates a whole set of major, almost at the scale of I mean, it's like infrastructural scale, or bigger than infrastructural scale. It's sort of imposition then on the planet
Hmm.
across other peoples,
Hmm.
as if they were entirely malleable and pliable, and as if
Hmm.
they didn't have structures and familial situations and cultures that needed to be like considered.
Hmm.
But if you deal with a block of a block of wood, and you just say, oh, it's this will be X, Y, or Z, and I don't care what. You've got the same sort of imposition. You're not being attentive to the actual material, the flux of the material itself, like the grain of the material. You're just um, being stupidly sort of imposing yourself on something as if you were the axiom or something, as if you were the truth or the God figure or something that can just reign supreme from above and everything will fall into order.
I want to finish on one last question, and I appreciate you giving so much of your time. The critique, I suppose, of Deleuze and Guattarian Deleuze-Guattarian approach is that it makes architecture a very complex process which is inaccessible to the woman and man on the street. That architecture becomes deeply philosophical, and in a Western European sense of it as well, where it's pretty specific. It's geographically and temporally bound. So I wonder whether the absorption of this Deleuze-Guattarian idea has functioned in a way to marginalize architecture from its wider public. And it has indeed politicized it, but it's a very specific politics which doesn't chime with many people's experiences of reality. And as a consequence, we've, as a profession, sort of self-edited out of the process of urban reproduction.
I don't know. I think when it comes down to what reading something like Deleuze and Guattari's work can do and does do, and has done in a sort of more gentle, ingrained kind of way over time, is that the whole aim is a little bit like, it's like saying the world, right? Like the world is incredibly complex and and brilliant. And I was walking to work this morning, and I walk up a hill, I walk up a hill for about 30 minutes. It's because it's Edinburgh, it just goes up and up and up and up, and then and I can see the architecture of the old city, as I'm approaching it and negotiating it, and I kept on and it's incredibly brilliant and intense and immensely complex, like almost impossibly sort of complex, right? And then I know what will happen is that if I wanted to start Googling and looking for what is Edinburgh, or how is Edinburgh, or like what is the built environment of Edinburgh, for example, what I'll find is stupidity. I'll find piles of statistics, right? Like we love to enumerate, right? And geographers will talk about a city in a very particular way, right?
Yeah.
And demographers in another way. There's planners in another way. There's a variety of ways, but when you try to deal with the actuality, the lived intensity of entering the old city, none of the discourse that's out there, or hardly any, like it would be a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, will actually try and do anything that deals with the intensity of it and the actual intensities that are involved in this. And it's like that with a lot of architecture. And I think what Deleuze and Guattari, and a reading of Deleuze and Guattari sort of does is it says that thought isn't something that wafts in the sky above things, right? And is complex, right? What it says is that thought at the moment and the way we are is really simplistic and really stupid as shit, right? It's sort of in the zone of oddity, right? Categorization, it's a type of it's really simple, right? And because the complexity and beauty and intensity and the liminality of the actual world is like way above what thought is. And what they're trying to do, and what we're trying to do, is to raise thought toward the actual, right? Towards actually life itself. Right? It's not about imposing thought on it or giving another thought to it, but it's like raising the thinking, because the concrete of our world is so much more complex and abstract than any thought itself. And what we're doing is just sort of shifting up. I mean, you never know who will be pulled along with that, or who, or who won't, or, and I'm completely okay with that in a way. But I like to imagine that when we can speak of our architecture, if I could look up, like what is Edinburgh or something like that on Google and start reading, brilliant, intense accounts that try and negotiate the reality, I'd be really happy. But instead, I'm just going to get stupid statistics or, it'll be horrendous. Years ago, I discovered or found this to be the case years ago. There's a particular memorial in Paris by Georges Pingasson. It's a memorial to the martyrs of deportation that sits behind Notre Dame Cathedral, and it's carved into the earth. And it was done, I think it was the mid-60s, I think. And the first time I went there, and you enter this memorial there, I was completely blown away. I found myself crying, and I didn't feel strangely conceptually or in a family sense, like genetically, whatever, ancestrally connected to the events that this was dealing with necessarily or completely. I felt like I was a little bit objectively removed from them in a certain sense, but I was completely overwhelmed and by the experience of this place. And then when I got out, I looked at what do we say about it, right? Like, how do we think this? And I looked up everything that had ever been written about this place, and it sort of says, oh, it uses, 160, or 1,600 quartz stones that are backlit and illuminated to represent X, or it is carved in this way to symbolize Y, or it was this discourse, right? And it could describe the material, and it could sort of say it was this deep, and it was this wide, and it was this, this sort of thing, and and it could historically place it and things, but none of that sort of dealt with the intensity, right? And so what Deleuze and Guattari, I think, start doing is giving us ways into life, right? The intensities of life itself, the complexities of life, the complexities of the built world in which we live, but also with which we design and are ourselves designed, in a way. And it's that access or that opening of possibility, I think, that is the real gift of something like the work of Deleuze and Guattari.
Wow, what a point to finish on. Fantastic. Concluded like a boss. Thank you so very much, Chris. That was really wonderful.
My pleasure.
To quote Radiohead, yesterday I woke up sucking a lemon, everything in its right place, which must be about Deleuze and Guattari and dislocation and fragmentation, surely. Thanks to Chris for speaking with me and for his excellent chat. Thanks to Bloomsbury for the PDF of the book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book and to Chris at work and on the socials. And thanks for listening.